Webster's International Dictionary defines the word free as not being in the position of a slave or serf, having the freedom of action and the legal and political rights of a citizen. That sounds good. I like that. Then he goes on for a full page explaining in deeper context what this is all about. Now, this to be free sounds like a very attractive state of life. Unfortunately, freedom is not free, folks. Freedom is not free. Freedom has never been free. Americans have been engaged in wars for years trying to keep this freedom that we enjoy so much. Between 1754 and 1815, we have 3 wars over a 61-year period, and we're not making any major changes today correcting any of that situation. There was conflict. In 1607, the settlers came to Jamestown, Virginia. Unfortunately, they were far more interested in looking for gold than they were in raising food. So they survived by stealing food from each other and from the Indians. Their charters were revoked in 1624. John Rolfe brought in West Indian tobacco seed, and tobacco grew so well there that by the year 1630, the colonists were shipping 1.5 million pounds of tobacco to England every year. They were able to do this because of the indentured servants. People would pay the passage of someone to come over to the colonies. Individual would then work 5 years, and following that, they would be free people. John Rolfe, if you remember, married Pocahontas, who was the daughter of Powhatan, the Indian chief. Pocahontas' brother, Opechanacow, never liked those colonists who came in here, never liked them. Opechanacow finally fought against the colonists at Jamestown and killed 347 of them in 1622. Freedom has never been free. Henry VIII disbanded the Catholic Church in England and established the Church of England. A group who called themselves the Reformists tried to change the Church of England. Being totally unsuccessful in this effort, they fled in 1608 to the Netherlands. Well, it didn't take very long. They realized they'd made a major mistake because the children were coming acclimated to the Netherlands culture, and they didn't like that. So if you recall, in 1620, they got on a boat, and they came on the Mayflower to what is now the United States. Their goal was to land near Jamestown, Virginia, but unfortunately they came in near Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It was too late to plant a crop, and only 44 of the original 102 survived that first winter. Freedom has never been free. By the end of the 1630s, there were 14,000 Puritans in the colonies. Over the years, the states Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, North Carolina, New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia were formed. Well, unfortunately, as these people continued to come over, they ran out of land. The French were quite comfortable in the area west of the Alleghenies. And so they sent George Washington, who at that age was 22, sent George Washington with a letter saying, "French, please leave this, we need your land." Well, they obviously weren't excited about granting George his wish. So George Washington led an attack against Fort Duquesne, and he lost that first battle. Now, in 1756, the colonists and the Britain began an all-out war against the French and the Indians, which continued until 1763. We've been in war a long time, folks. Freedom has never been free. American Revolutionary War. George III said, "Colonists, it's time to pay your dues. I've been taking care of you all of these years, and it's time for you to pay your dues." He began then to raise tax. The Stamp Act, the tea tax. Taxation without representation became the byword. From 1773 to 1776, the taxation that Parliament piled on the colonists was unbearable. So the colonists had their first Continental Congress in 1774. They made a plea to British Parliament. Hey, back off a little bit, give us a chance. In 1775, they established a Second Continental Congress. They established a Continental Army. Parliament declared that members of the Congress were rebels and traitors. They then met in next year, 1776, on June the 11th, to draft a document that would say to England, we no longer will be subject to Redcoat rule. And on June the 11th, began work on a Declaration of Independence. We're told that Thomas Jefferson finished that first draft in 17 days. They signed this Declaration of Independence, a message to the British colonists, we will no longer be subject to Redcoat rule. Now, who were those 56 men who put their signatures on that document? 20 were lawyers or judges. 9 were landowners or farmers. 11 were merchants. 12 were doctors, ministers, or politicians. They knew the risk of demanding their freedom from England. They knew the chance that they were taking. They knew very well that freedom has never been free. They knew that war was inevitable once they signed that document. And if they won the war, they would be subject to years of hardship and recovery. And if they lost the war, they would be hanged as traitors. Freedom has never been free. They pledged our lives, our fortunes, our sacred trust. Now, what was life like in 1776? Some merchants and plantation owners were earning greater than $500,000 a year. The British simply wanted the colonies to share that wealth. You recall the Sons of Liberty dumped $3 million worth of British tea into Boston Harbor. What became of those 56 men who put their names on that document? 5 were captured by the British, tortured, and died. 12 homes were destroyed, occupied, totally lost everything that they had. 9 died in the war that followed. Carter Braxton of Virginia sold his home, gave all of his money to support the war effort, died in rags. One son was so harassed he moved his family 5 times in 5 months to get away from the harassment. Thomas Nelson put $10 million, his total estate, into the war effort, was never reimbursed, died a pauper. John Hart, driven from his dying wife's bedside, when he came back, his wife had died and been buried, and his 13 children had disappeared. He died a broken man shortly after. John Hancock watched Boston burn, and we're told said, "Burn, Boston, burn." Though it makes John Hancock a beggar, it is for the good of the cause. These 56 men were not wild-eyed dreamers. They were men of wealth and position. They were willing to place their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred trust in jeopardy for our freedom. Freedom has never been free. How prepared were the colonies to enter a war with Great Britain? Well, number one, the colonies were not united. Only 40 to 50% of the colonies supported this war. 25,000 of the colonies fought with the British. They were totally unprepared for war. The British Navy was a formidable power. The colonial Navy was almost zero. George Washington led an army that never exceeded 90,000 people at any time. British hired 13,000 German mercenaries to expand their capacity to fight against the colonists. Battles continued from 1775 until 1783. George Washington, who we are told couldn't tell a lie, was famous at the lies that he told to the British. He planted rumors in Philadelphia and New York, which were both British control, about the size of the colonial troop strength. Major hurdles for the British. Although the British Navy controlled all the eastern coast and all the seaboards, over 90% of the colonists lived inland. They couldn't get to them. It was too vast a landmass for the redcoats and their German mercenaries to dominate. 3,000 miles of Atlantic to bring every bit of food, the clothing, the ammunition, everything that they needed, made it very, very difficult for the British to fight that war. Several European countries joined in with the colonies to help them. France was a major contributor. 37 French warships trapped 8,700 British troops at Yorktown, causing the British to give up the war with the colonies. As a result of this, the Paris Treaty was signed in 1783, and the colonies were given sovereignty over the American territory bordered on the north by Canada, on the south by Florida, and on the west by the Mississippi River. Freedom has never been free. Well, it didn't get any easier following this war. The British Navy dominated all the seaports along the eastern coast. They continued to harass the Americans. The British restricted trade between the colonies and France. Britain received 80% of the cotton and 50% of all other exports from the colonies. 175 British warships required a lot of sailors, and they were stopping American ships off the coast and taking the sailors and putting them on their ships and forcing them to be impounded sailors working on the British ships. British incurred Indian raids against the colonists. In the country that we know today as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the British were encouraging Indians to raid them. Finally, on June the 1st in 1812, President James Madison addressed Congress regarding these British grievances. Congress voted to declare war against the British. Now, unfortunately, the New England states were never supportive of that war. The War of 1812, the New England states continued to trade with Britain and did nothing to support that war effort. That war was fought primarily with state militias who were not only poorly trained, but they were poorly paid. British attacked Washington to add insult to injury, burning the Capitol, the White House, and the Navy Yards. Now, in 1814, the British and the colonists got tired of this war and sent representatives to Ghent, Belgium. A treaty ultimately was signed to end the War of 1812 on the 24th of December in 1814. But while the negotiations were taking place, there were still battles going on. The Battle of New Orleans, as an example, continued during the time when they were going through the negotiations. In addition, the British attempted to attack Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry lay right at the mouth of the Baltimore Harbor. The colonists had a 30-foot by 42-foot flag flying over Fort McHenry. Now, during this war, both the British and the colonists had a large number of enemy prisoners. A Georgetown lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key, along with a Colonel John Skinner, who was an agent for prison exchange, went out in a sloop to board a British ship to negotiate an exchange of the British prisoners that the colonists held for the colonists who the British held. This British admiral that they negotiated with agreed to exchange prisoners on a one-to-one basis. We're told that Key went below where 1,000 Americans were in the hold of this ship. We're told that Francis Scott Key went below and said to the men, "Men, I have successfully negotiated your release. Tonight you'll be able to get out of this filth and those chains and return home." He then went back on deck, and the admiral says, "Mr. Key, we have a problem. We will honor our agreement, but after tonight it really makes no difference." Francis Scott Key said, "What do you mean?" The admiral said, "We've issued an ultimatum on Fort McHenry. They will either lower that flag or we will remove Fort McHenry from the face of the earth." Mr. Key scanned the horizon, and we're told that Key looked out and what he saw were hundreds of dots on the horizon. The admiral says, "Mr. Key, that is the entire British war fleet. In 2.5 hours, they will be within firing range. The war will be over. These men will be released." Key said, "You can't destroy that fort. That fort is predominantly women and children. It's not really a military fort." Everyone said, oh, we've given them a way out. We've told them if they will lower that flag, the shelling will cease and they will be under British rule. Key went below, told the 1,000 men. They said, how many ships are there? He said, thousands, hundreds. He then said, I'll go back up and keep you informed of what's going on. Twilight came. The shelling began. They said it was a deafening sound. Key went below. The men said, tell us about the flag. Is the flag still flying? Tell us. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, the bombardment continued. He could see that flag wavering, but it never went down. The admiral said to Key, those people are insane. Don't they know this is an impossible situation? Key remembered the words that George Washington had said once. The thing that sets the American Christian apart from other people is the fact that he will die on his feet before he will live on his knees. The admiral then said, we've directed all of our guns to concentrate on that rampart where the flag waves. We simply don't understand why that flag doesn't go down. It has taken so many hits. Key could hear the 1,000 men below praying, God, keep that flag waving. Sunrise came. The firing had ceased. Key boarded a sloop and went to Fort McHenry. What he found was a flag and flagpole that had suffered many direct hits. It did not fall because men, fathers, had used their bodies to hold that flagpole upright. Despite the flag being the primary target of the guns, it never fell. So Key found that what had held that flagpole up was patriots' bodies. They used their bodies literally to hold that flag up until they died. Then their bodies were removed and others took their place. What held that flagpole erect was patriot bodies. Freedom has never been free. Key wrote the words on the back of an envelope that we sang in elementary school and we sang in high school and at sporting events. He titled it Defense of Fort McHenry. And he wrote under that, sing to tune to Anacron in heaven. And what Key wrote that day were these words. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave? We're told that a month later, an actor sang that song in Baltimore to the tune as suggested by Francis Scott Key. And he called it the Star-Spangled Banner. And what he sang that night was this. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Freedom has never been free. Freedom will never be free. The freedom we enjoy today was paid for with the lives of thousands of men and women who gave their life for our freedom. God bless them and God bless America. Thank you.